Hello, I'm Susan Jamieson and I was invited to speak to you today to answer the question, do we need to worry about our trainees' learning styles? Before I answer this, I'll just briefly say something about my background. The organisers asked me to do this. My own background is biomedical science and I did a PhD in London in biochemistry and worked for some years in the Imperial Cancer Research Fund and then at the Beatson Institute in Glasgow. And I joined the university in 1993. I became increasingly involved in teaching and eventually was director of year one of the medical school and deputy head of the medical school with a remit for the biosciences, so the early years of the curriculum. I also developed and ran a master's in molecular medicine. And during the later years of my involvement with the medical school, I was doing a part-time doctorate in education at the University of Strathclyde, and I got that about 10 years ago. And this experience combined to put me in a position to develop and deliver our online programme in health professions education. So Andy Dunn, one of your colleagues, is a student on this programme, and it was through Andy that I was kindly invited to come along today. And just to show Andy that I do try to practice what I preach, my next slide shows the intended learning outcomes for this session. So I hope by the end of my talk you'll be able to describe and critique the concept of learning styles and reflect on whether and how preferred learning styles should and can be accommodated by healthcare science training or in healthcare science training. I think when we come across a term, a concept, the first thing we want to do is define it. And I offer two definitions here. The first is that learning styles refers to typologies or classifications of learning by which students can be categorised and which also aim to highlight individual differences among learners. But the second goes a bit further, whereas the first definition is really talking about students' preferences for being presented with information. The second definition goes that it's not just about how they like to receive information, but which mode of instruction is more effective for our learners. How do we know that learning is effective? Well, we test it essentially. For declarative knowledge, which is knowledge like factual information, mathematical formulae, that kind of thing, we ask people to let us know whether they have acquired the relevant knowledge by asking them to perform in a test, and we usually ask them to write down words or maybe numbers that show that they have the knowledge that we're hoping they have gained. But probably, I think, quite important in your context is procedural knowledge, which is how to do things. And we therefore want people to be able to show us that they can undertake a particular process or a particular procedure. And in that case, we're looking at task performance, and we would perhaps use the criterion of how quickly they do something or the quality of the output or the product. So when we're thinking about learning styles, we're thinking about ways that people differ in the way that they like to be presented with information. And there is also this idea that if they are presented with information in that way, then it is more effective for their learning as measured by a test or a task that they're asked to undertake. I wonder if you have a dominant learning style, a dominant or preferred one. You might like to take a moment to think about this. Do you have a dominant learning style? And if you were to describe it in just a word or two, how would you do that? So I am making an assumption that several of you will have used these words as describing your learning style, your dominant or preferred learning style. And that's because the VARC classification of learning styles is one of the most popular. I think probably lots of people have heard of that. And VARC is an acronym that stands for visual, auditory, reading and writing, or kinesthetic. And to elaborate a little bit, what this is saying is that visual learners, they like to receive information in visual form, so pictures, drawings, diagrams. Auditory learners like to receive verbal information, so they might enjoy listening to a lecture or they might enjoy an audio recording. People who learn by reading and writing like to engage with documents, text-based information, or to create their own text-based information, writing. And people who are kinesthetic learners are said to be those who actually like to do the practical task and they learn through that. So this classification is all well and good if that is what it's about, how people prefer to receive information. However, as Pashler et al. Have emphasised here, the evolution of the learning styles concept has become that people believe that for effective learning, instruction is best provided in a format that matches the preference of the learner. I should say that Pashler et al. Don't themselves hold this view, but they are reiterating what has become a very popular view. And they call this the meshing hypothesis. And the idea is really that if you mesh together or match together the learner's preferred style and the style of instruction that you as the educator gives, then you will achieve the most effective learning. And as I said, this is widely held as correct, but there is no good evidence to back it up. And in the discipline of education, it's actually been critiqued for a long time. And one of the most vocal critiques is Frank Cofield, who worked in the Institute of Education in London. And he wrote a very good chapter. It's a bit obscured by my photograph there, but it's Cofield 2012. And this and other references are in my slide at the end of my talk. And he used the example that if you want to learn how to make a dish, something to eat, and you were offered the choice of learning how to make it by reading instructions, a recipe, or being told how to make it, or just getting stuck in and having a go, that would be to force you to make an artificial selection. And in fact, people would probably use a mix of different ways of learning how to do something. And I think his chapter is very accessible, and if you can get hold of the book in a library or somewhere, you might enjoy reading it. The actual book title is Bad Education. There's also a quite short article by Cofield in 2013, which makes similar points. And both of those are building on a systematic review that was carried out by Cofield and his colleagues. And they did an academic systematic review, which is the 2004 A citation, and they also produced a report that was for practitioners, which had less of the jargon from research or theory. And they were asking questions about what are the most influential models of learning styles, what is the supporting evidence for these, what are the implications for teaching, and what is the evidence of impact on students' learning. And to summarise a lot of work by these researchers, one of the things is that they found that there was a massive literature, and this was 20 years ago. The literature has been growing and growing since then. And many educators ignore this literature. It's very common for people to cite reviews or even non-peer reviewed information when they're talking about learning styles. There's confusion over the meaning of learning styles, and people mix it up with other concepts such as cognitive styles. Even at the time that Cofield et al. Were doing their review, there were 71 different models for learning styles, and they talked about 13 major models, and the others were mainly derivatives of these. The research that they were reviewing was often small scale and context dependent, and it was also fragmented in that it was in different disciplines, and the disciplines maybe subscribed to different learning styles, or they also did not necessarily communicate very well across the disciplines. And another issue with the research on learning styles was the commercialization of the whole learning styles idea. And this was seen in the creation of inventories, which are questionnaires. And you may be familiar with some of these, and you may even have completed one of them. For example, there is the Kolb Learning Style Inventory, or Honey and Mumford's Learning Style Questionnaire, and a couple of others I've put up there. There are lots of these things. And one of the points that Cofield et al. Made that these questionnaires are not particularly reliable or valid. There are certain tests that have to be fulfilled for psychologists to consider a questionnaire as a reliable and valid instrument, and even the best learning style inventory doesn't meet all of these. So to sum up Cofield's view in the book chapter, he sums up that some psychologists, when they're talking about learning styles inventories, some psychologists are failing to recognise the complexity and contrariness of human nature and ignoring the obvious point that the context often powerfully shapes how we behave. And when we're talking about behaviour here, we're talking about learning. And I think an example I could try to give you to illustrate that from my own context is that I used to work in a dermatology lab, and one of the things that I was trying to do was to microinject individual skin cells, keratinocytes. And the main way, although my normal preference would have been to learn things by reading and writing, the only way that I could really learn how to do the microinjection was by trial and error, so a more kinesthetic mode. And in fact, I also had to bring in the visual because I looked at photographs showing the relative dimensions of a single cell and the bore of a micropipette. And I also read information about how other people had undertaken the microinjection technique. So by that example, I'm hoping to illustrate to you that even if you have a preference for learning in a particular way, it may not suit all contexts, and you may have to use multiple styles, if you like, to learn something. Another key reference in the literature is this one by Pashler et al., which was actually published in December 2008, and sometimes probably different versions, sometimes it's given as 2008 and sometimes 2009. And Pashler et al. Were 4 American professors of psychology, and they undertook a review of the literature to look for particular studies that had particular experimental designs that would show clearly whether or not being educated in your preferred learning style would lead to more effective learning. And they summarised that learners do express preferences for being presented with information in particular ways. Individuals do express variable aptitudes for different types of thinking or for processing different types of information, but there is little evidence that a learner's preferred learning style will let them learn more effectively. So the idea has been known in education for some time that the learning styles idea is a myth, or to be more exact, the idea that if you are taught, educated via your preferred learning style, you'll be a more successful learner. And HP educators are catching on. So for example, in 2018, Jeff Norman at McMaster's Medical School wrote that learning style is the poster child of educational myths. And he went on to say that educators are making curriculum decisions based on inadequate evidence, incorrect evidence, or none at all. Another author, Jimmy Lepink, who is a statistician working in the Netherlands in a health professions education context, he raised the point that much of the literature on learning styles is based on individuals self-reporting their learning style by using one of the inventories that I've mentioned already. And he asked, can we be sure learners are aware of their learning styles and can reliably and validly report on them? And then there is some evidence of or about learning styles in the health professions education context. And that doesn't necessarily support the meshing hypothesis. That is, it doesn't particularly support that being taught or educated in your preferred learning style leads to more effective learning. And an example of this is by authors Hussman and O'Loughlin, and they were looking with undergraduate medical students at their learning, and they found that students self-reported VARC results, so whether they saw themselves as visual, auditory or whatever learners, did not correlate with the students' reported study strategies or with their performance in the undergraduate anatomy course. So what? Does it really all matter? And I think, yes, it does matter because, well, one of the main things is that if we believe that students, if there is evidence that students learn more effectively in different ways, then we are under an obligation to provide our education, training, teaching in ways that will speak to the people who have a preference for visual, auditory or whatever. There are very many different labels for learning styles, and that becomes very resource heavy. And yet, as Pashley Rital said back in 2008, and it is still the case, there is no adequate evidence base to justify incorporating learning styles assessments into general education practice. So limited education resources would be better, in their view, devoted to adopting other educational practices that have a strong evidence base. And Cofield agreed with this so much that in his 2012 chapter he reiterated this quotation in its entirety. So essentially, if you have limited resource, and that includes your time as an educator, then there are other things that you could probably do more usefully to actually facilitate your learners' learning. So in addition to the resource issue, other points have been raised in the literature. So Sun et al. Have recently published, and they raised the issue that there are field-specific beliefs in particular disciplines about learning styles and their link to academic success, that individuals with specific styles may not succeed in a particular discipline. And then Sun et al.'s own research was looking at, in the school context, and they were looking at whether learning style information influenced parents, teachers, or children's own thinking about how those students would fare in their learning. And they found that there was an influence. And if this was borne out in other levels of education, it shows or suggests that we have the potential for bias or for discrimination based on what people declare as their preferred learning style. Antoniuk also made the point that students who exhibit learning difficulties with a specific learning style might internalise these difficulties as fixed aspects of their learning ability. So they might think that they cannot become better at learning through that modality, or they might even worse think about that they are not able to learn at all, which we wouldn't obviously want as educators. So I think that there are arguments in the literature that it does matter if we perpetuate what is a myth, that learning in your preferred style necessarily leads to more effective learning, higher scores in tests, or better task performance. So to go back to the question that I posed at the outset, do we need to worry about our trainees' learning styles? The easy answer is no. It's not evidence-based, so we don't have to do it. However, I think there are better answers than that. And the first thing I'd like to suggest is that if we want to talk about learning styles, we really should think about saying preferred learning styles, or ideally learning preferences, to acknowledge that that is what they are, that is all the evidence supports them to be, preferences for learning, without saying anything about whether they are actually going to be more effective for specific individuals. But moving forward, we can if we have time and space in our curriculum, we can encourage discussion about learning styles and indeed about any aspect of learning amongst our learners. But if we are talking about learning styles, I think we have an obligation to raise awareness about the myth that your preferred learning style necessarily is more effective for your learning. If possible, we should use multiple formats. If for example, we have an obligation under accessibility legislation to offer our teaching in audio and visual form, and basically it's been driven by legislation, but it is good practice educationally, and it does obviously facilitate people that like and auditory or regard themselves as auditory learners and people who regard themselves as visual learners. So if it's possible and pragmatic, but that comes back to that resource issue, it's also worthwhile trying to encourage learners to learn in their non-preferred formats, because they may actually discover that they can comprehend something that's more challenging using a different format. And an example from my own experience would be trying to understand signalling transduction mechanisms at the intracellular level. I have always found much easier if I use a visual format and animation rather than just simply reading information. And we can also favour other evidence-based means to enhance learning, such as aligning curriculum goals with our students' goals, building positive working alliances, which really translates to showing students that we care about their learning, and also using motivational strategies, self-testing and feedback, which do have an evidence base. And for my last slide, I would just like to say that what we should really think about is applying principles of universal design for learning, and that is to make learning as widely as accessible to everybody, and then it is hopefully more likely to meet the preferences for individual learners. Universal design for learning is not a new idea. Back in 2000, Rose said, in a universally designed curriculum, multiple means of representation, expression and engagement are available as a normal part of every learning environment and every assessment. And there's a little bit more information about universal design for learning at the website on my slide there. So that's really all I have to say. I hope the presentation is helpful and encourages you to think about this issue. And my last slide contains the references that I used for this talk. Thank you very much. Goodbye.